Do you find that most of your writing comes from that time in your life? Do you write about things that have happened to you since moving away from Russia?
Yeah, I had stories set in the United States since then, and still do. Yeah, of course. But if there is a project in which I am involved, consciously or subconsciously, that would be one of telling the part of my life that occurred in a country that no longer exists. So the Atlantis of modern world, and I was a witness to it, and I lived there. I was born there, and I lived there, and I think that that's an interesting way of dealing with my life, of telling a story, um, and I think that I'm in a position to do it rather uniquely among my fellow Russian emigres of my generation because of my English being better and because I can do it. There are many very talented and really quite brilliant contemporary American writers and Canadian who came from the Soviet Union with their parents during the different waves of Soviet Jewish immigration, be it in early or late 70s or later than that. But almost invariably they came as little children, 6 or 7 or 8 years old, which basically means that they're native speakers of English. They don't write in Russian, and not that it's not the language that they feel entirely comfortable with in order to write. And yeah, they tell the stories that they heard from their parents, or that they themselves imagined, or or through friendships that they managed to establish with. But it's a different matter. They're Americans, in terms of their upbringing and mentality. Americans, Canadians, North Americans. I'm not a native speaker of English, and although I'm a U.S. citizen and permanent resident of Canada, I don't feel that entirely that that my roots they are here, of course, but the main part of my life took place in that country, in a different language.
You have a very, very good command of English and a broad vocabulary, and I know that you've worked hard to make this your second language. Have you ever published anything in Russian?
Yeah, I published. Well, I was very active in samizdat, right, in the underground self-publishing. So I published stories, and I published a novella, and I published translations of American poetry and prose, and I published some essays.
Since moving to America?
No, that was back in the Soviet Union. Since moving to America, I've been meaning constantly to keep writing in Russian, but it doesn't work that way. It just somehow proved difficult for me to do, to find time to do both. And so I wrote a few essays and short pieces in Russian and got it published there. But somehow my project has become writing in English and reading English primarily, and teaching in English, which is, as you can imagine, is a job, and it's more than a job. It's time. It's a very time consuming, lifelong occupation.
Mm-hmm.
So much as I would have loved to write simultaneously in English and in Russian, but that didn't work out that way. I do, however, post a lot of Russian texts on Facebook, mainly of political nature, because it's about Russia, and it mainly is of interest to Russian readers, and so I do that a lot. So my Facebook actually represents fairly like a split between two languages.
And I mean, what do you find is the major difference in writing in English versus writing in Russian for you?
Well, the difference, quite simply, is that Russian is my native language and English isn't. So it's a not natural process of writing in English for me. I have to work on it. I have to overcome the resistance of language. There are pluses and minuses to it. And when I first came to the United States, I found that I was unable to write in Russian because Russian offered absolutely no resistance to my emotional state. It was like air that you breathe. You don't notice it. And Russian is very good at any rate in aiding and abetting one's tendency to overwrite. Or if you want to wallow in misery and self-pity, it will just happily to encourage you to do that. It's very good for that. So I found that I was unable to step away from myself while writing in Russian, so I had to put up a certain like transparent membrane between myself and my life, and estrange myself from myself, as it were. And English served that purpose, which language I didn't know well at that time, so I could not really at all, write about my sadness or thoughts that I might have committed the gravest error of my life, just by leaving the Soviet Union, and then now there was no going back, and about all of how I don't know what I'm going to do, I couldn't express any of that in English. English, in that sense, was completely indifferent to my psychological state. I had to just be adequate to every single sentence, but I mentioned that already. It's just like it was a mechanical exercise. In Russian still, sometimes when I've completed a long piece, let's say in English, or especially like difficult passage, and I feel I still feel energy, I kind of unwind by kind of rewarding myself by writing in Russian. So I will just go on and just write a piece in Russian and post it on Facebook. It's a relief for me, because I don't have to, to struggle at all there. In English, I have to. In English, I had to, even though style stays literary style, or a style of one's self-expression remains the same throughout the languages, because, as Andrei said, style is the person. So we all have our inner rhythms and certain tonality and certain mode of expression, accelerations and decelerations, and certain circle of vocabulary and so forth. That is irrespective of one's language. Of course, you have to know both languages well, or however many languages, in order to be expressive. But English represents an obstacle, and that's a good thing in many ways, because it enables me to do things that I wouldn't have. For instance, the very fact that I read much slower in English than I do in Russian has enabled me to probably become better as in this occupation that I've dedicated myself to, which is to say instructor, teacher, professor of creative writing of English. That is to say that sometimes and often I notice things that could serve as seeds or beginnings of a story, something that is just, I noticed, mentioned in passing, or here and there, or repeated words accidentally, or something that it gives me an idea that this is where a student story could reorient itself or start growing, and this is what that story would really be about. I might not have noticed that had I been able to just zoom through the text if I were reading with the speed of a native reader. If that makes sense. And I think it does, yeah. So there are pluses and minuses to it. Also in English, I find that, for instance, it's easier for me, or at least more interesting, which is to say easier, to write a sentence that's 1,200 words, right, than to write simple declarative sentences. Which is why I find it difficult to write just a strict biography or autobiography or like a memoir. It's just, I need to find an angle of interest in what I write linguistically. I need to write interesting sentences. I find myself, it's not organic for me and natural to write just simple declarative sentences. It's just, it's not my native language. It becomes my native language when I find my own angle to expressing myself, or when the memory is so vivid and so clear, like in the piece that I've just read to you, that I don't even think of just, I know exactly what each sentence needs to express, and, so that there is a difference. But basically the voice remains the same. The result is different. I may or may not have mentioned it, but for instance, genius of American and Russian literature, Vladimir Nabokov, in one of his passages, and I'm not quoting verbatim, but in Speak Memory, I think he says he bemoans the loss of my, and I think he used the words untrammeled, unfettered, free-flowing Russian language, and then with this typical, I think, if I recall correctly, with this typical passive-aggressive attitude. But none of that should be any of readers' concern, right? Just which is like, why did you mention it then? But I think that the Nabokov of his English novels and stories may be a better writer than in Russian, because Russian naturally, again, encourages, abets one's tendency for overwrite. And Nabokov's very prone to, he was a genius of long rolling sentence, and Russian encourages to do that with its lack of order of words in a sentence and so forth. So just, I find personally that English reined him in and made his writing orally more poignant and more expressive somehow. In Russian, I think he often creates the impression of purplishness and overwrite, and then and verbiage becomes so thick and so unruly and beautiful that it just sometimes drowns out the storyline.
Yeah. And I think he completely stopped writing in Russian by the end of his career, right?
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. It is difficult to write in two languages. It is difficult. It's too much of manual shifting of gears. At some, it probably would have been different if I were completely bilingual, and that's a phenomenon that one has here in, let's say, in Montreal, like in very few other places. Among my graduate students have always been people who consider themselves first francophones. But you wouldn't, if they hadn't told me, I would never have known.
Right, yeah.
They write in Russian, they write in English, and they
grow up fully in two different languages.
Fully and completely, and that's very, very rare. I cannot think of any other such examples. Like I said, like lots of Russian emigres, and among them great writers, and children speak the language of parents speaking at home. But the language of the street, of the school, of their friends is infinitely stronger. Right. So they become, if they come before the age of, let's say, 14, between ages of 14 and 16, which is when the line in the sand, so to speak, seems to be drawn linguistically. You come earlier than that, you will not continue to be native Russian speaker. You will speak Russian very well and without an accent, but it will not be the language that is a live language. Essentially, it will be the kind of slightly calcified language. You'll be a native speaker of English, American English. Yeah. But if you come after the age of, let's say, 17, then you probably will forever retain your accent, for one thing, unless you put some serious effort into getting rid of it, which is to say, and there is only one organization probably that can help you with that, and that's called CIA. I think you can get professional help from them in that respect if you want to lose your accent. So, but more than that is just basically, you probably will still remain native speaker of Russian. It's a very interesting topic in and of itself. But unless you are, but I don't know any other places where people are completely bilingual. And I wonder what it must feel like, because I know lots of people who are almost bilingual, like myself. I'm almost bilingual, and I certainly do not translate anything in my head as I'm speaking. It's just that it's a different part of me, but there is no mistaking me for a native speaker, for one thing, because even though it's not very strong, but it's an accent.
Right.
And secondly, my English is that of a very well educated, autodidactic person, which is to say, an example would be, I think, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I think, for instance, if I were to find myself somewhere in the rural, let's say, Alabama or Mississippi, and I would engage in a conversation with some old guy who is just sitting out on the porch and drinking beer, And the guy is, first off, I would have difficulty understanding him, and he would have difficulty probably understanding me because of the tremendous difference of accents. But more than that, he probably within 2 minutes of our conversation would know that I was not born in the United States. That English is not my native language, because even though my English is, technically speaking, is infinitely better than his, it's academic English. I know more words than him. I know how to use them correctly in a sentence. But what I don't know is how to be incorrect, right? It's not intuitively, right? I do too, but not quite, So in other words, by the same token, if I were to find myself, let's say, somewhere in a village in Siberia, and half-drunk Russian old man sitting out on the porch in summertime, because not in winter, and drinking whatever he's drinking, and I would engage in a conversation with him, he would know, without beyond the shadow of a doubt, that I actually am a native speaker of Russian. It's just that I'm not from his village or any village at all.
Would he know you to be from Leningrad?
No,
Right.
Probably not, because although if people start thinking about it, they claim that they can detect a difference between the accents between Leningrad and most other. He would know that I'm not from certain parts of Russia. He would know that I'm not from the south of Volga, for instance, but he would know the subtleties of accents difference between Moscow and Leningrad. People who are highly educated and pay attention to that would notice that, conceivably. But that would be like difference between like Canadian and American accent,
Right, It takes a little while to notice.
Takes a while to understand, to figure it out. No, he wouldn't know that, but he would definitely know that I'm a native speaker of Russian. He just because I would be just as comfortable using subnormative Russian language, that his whole language would be completely subnormative, but I would be comfortable understanding and talking. But he would know that, of course, I'm from big city and I have nothing to do with his life. But he wouldn't think that I was born in America and grew up speaking English. It's an interesting phenomenon. I don't know where else people are so readily.
Switzerland, maybe.
Maybe Switzerland. Well, maybe Switzerland, some parts of Italy, I guess, right? I mean, where there are maybe some European countries, like Netherlands, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
Belgium, maybe at some point. So, but otherwise, no, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. India, maybe.
Maybe India, yeah. Wherever people, or I just got back from Kenya, where, everybody knows at least 3 languages and most people more, with the exception of very old people in central parts where they, but every Kenyan speaks her or his tribal language, and there are 42 tribes. And that's their native language. But Swahili is also their native language, and that's the language that sort of like unites all the tribes. It's the language that's tens of millions of people speak all throughout East Africa. But everybody speaks English too. It's the official language. They speak, of course, it with the next, but it's native language. All 3 languages are native languages for them.
And is it the same? I mean, I'm more familiar with Indian and Pakistani culture, where it's sort of one flows into the other.
Right.
They substitute words through different languages that way. Right. Yeah.
So so there is a difference in that. I have to work in English in order to find the right angle, the right to develop certain degree of interest in my writing, and then to start rolling. In Russian, I don't need, I can get rolling on any subject, including boring sentences as well, if I have to. But I don't have to stop and pause and think as I would in English when I'm rolling basically with a story. I don't think about such things. But if I'm writing like a paper, I would think periodically, is it a or they here? Native speakers don't think about those things, and in Russian, the equivalent in Russian, I wouldn't think about those things.
Right.
And lots of things like that.
But you never do something where you get your ideas down in Russian first and then think, I'm going to work on this story in English.
No.
They're very distinct from each other.
No, I don't, because an idea is an idea for a story. I don't, once they are in my head, while they're still in my head, they're wordless. Their thoughts. And even if I'm just sort of like trying to rearrange them in order of telling of a story, they're still wordless. They're still thoughts. But then, of course, I will write them in English, and that would just would require more of a preparation of how to start a story. In Russian, that wouldn't be a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
And a story like the one that you just read, The Night That Andropov Died, have you heard what the reception of that kind of story would be in Russian, or is it just it's not even meant for a Russian audience to really?
It's not really meant for Russian audience, but in Russian it would be the same as English. It would be interesting for people because except that in Russian everybody would know who Andropov was, and in North America less than 50% of people, I would say safely less than 10% of people would know who Andropov was, even though he was the kind of guy who actually could play a very pivotal role in destroying the Earth completely. So, but he was Reagan's counterpart, and when Reagan was president, Andropov was he was at the helm of power in the Soviet Union when Reagan was saying that Soviet Union is evil empire. That's what he meant. Soviet Union was really doing outrageous stuff at that point, just downing Korean airliners and so forth, those kind of things. So I think people would find it less exotic, obviously. For them, it would be history that is completely comprehensible and part of, if they're young, that would be their parents' history and so forth, but it wouldn't be from a different part of the world. But people would find it interesting, I would imagine.